It's gonna be alright.
Welcome to the Stoa. Good to have all your beautiful faces back. This is a continuation of the Entity Pill series that we're having at the Stoa, where we explore the phenomenon of disincarnate entities. And last week we had the wonderful Bob Faulkner come in to talk about unattached burdens, which is what they call entities in internal family systems. And his book is The Others Within Us. Next week, we have Richard Gallagher coming in talking about demons. He's the world's leading psychiatrist talking about demonic possessions, and this is his book. So the series is a transperspectival exploration, meaning that we're exploring this phenomenon from different perspectives. And today we're very lucky to have David Luke joining us. David's a psychonaut and associate professor of psychology at University of Greenwich. And his research focuses on transpersonal experiences and altered states of consciousness, especially via psychedelics. And he'll be talking about entities encountered through psychedelic experiences such as DMT and ayahuasca. And in commonly, these entities, there's three explanations for them. One is like these, let's say, hallucination. The other one is like a psychological phenomenon. Or the third one is that it's an encounter with other worlds, which is the name of one of his books, Other Worlds, Psychedelics and Exceptional Human Experience. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to tag in David in a moment. If you can hear me, that is, we had some entities were interfering with our connection a moment ago, but looks like we're good. So I'm going to take David in. I believe he's had a slide presentation for us. And then we're going to treat this as a regular Stoa session. So if you have any questions anytime, pop them in the chat. And then after David's presentation, we'll engage in the Q&A. So that being said, David, tagging you in, welcome to the Stoa.
Hey, thank you, Peter. Thanks so much for having me on board. Great topic, obviously, but I'm a little bit biased, maybe. I've got some slides I can share. I think you've given me permission to position even. Let me see how that works. Okay, so just ignore the little banner down the side and I'll take it away. And I'm going to talk not for very long because I'm really more interested in the discussion side of things, and we can freestyle and see where that goes. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you about DMT in particular and discarnate entities. And DMT, for those of you who don't know, is an extremely potent, naturally occurring psychedelic. There are many psychedelics out there, but the reason I'm focusing on DMT in particular is because it quite reliably induces entity experiences. And it's a very simple molecule. If you know anything about molecules, you can see here, it's structurally very similar to serotonin. It passes easily across the blood-brain barrier, and you can ingest it. Well, you can consume it. Usually you have to vaporize it or inject it or mix it with other chemicals, as they do in ayahuasca, the hallucinogenic jungle decoction from the Amazon, because actually DMT gets broken down in your body by enzymes in your blood and in your stomach called MAO inhibitors. And when they mix DMT containing plants in the Amazon with other plants, those other plants contain chemicals which prevent the enzymes in your body breaking down the DMT. That's a little bit of a crazy chemistry lesson for those of you not aware. But most commonly in its kind of purer form, just DMT alone, people tend to vaporize it because it's kind of easily accessible to the brain. I should say that it's naturally occurring in the human body, actually, anyway. We all have DMT in us, even though it's a Schedule 1 Class A drug for which you can get a lifetime in prison for production. Ironically, we all produce it, possibly most of the time. We're not entirely sure. and it's found broadly across the whole spectrum of life, probably all mammals, all plants, most other animals, apart from insects. Weirdly enough, it's not being detected in insects, and it's not been found in fungi. Fungi have their own version, 4-hydroxy DMT, which is commonly known as psilocybin, actually, or psilocin in that case. But when DMT is vaporized, if you get the technique right, that is, you can successfully inhale enough DMT in one go, in one inhalation, if you have the right breathing technique. And by the time you finished inhaling, you have left this world, as it kind of commonly appears to us, and you are somewhere completely other, another world. And it's very quick, therefore, and very short acting as well, lasts about 10 minutes. It's hard to kind of, if you haven't had the experience, like describe how intense that experience is. So, you know, some people, I think one of the best descriptions I've heard of what the DMT experience is like is that it's a bit like being punched in the back of the head by God. And that seems to kind of fit the data quite well as well, as I'll show you quite soon. And there are various kind of phenomena that may occur when you have a DMT experience. So classically, you get geometric patterns. That's the kind of first and most common thing that everybody gets. They're a little bit more elaborate than this. These are actually taken from some mescaline experiments in the 1920s, when they were first kind of identified, called entoptics. Phenomena produced within the visual system, although we don't know exactly where they are produced. And they're usually a little bit more colorful, to say the least, and elaborate, and often people describe them in very verbose ways, because they are quite extraordinary. So, for instance, this is some Shipibo artwork from the Amazon, what we call yarn painting. It's made from threads, and it depicts the geometric patterns that are seen under the influence of ayahuasca. Although in this case, this is not just what the patterns that are seen, this is what the sound of the ayahuasca songs that the shaman sings look like, because often people have intense synesthetic experiences as well with DMT. So there's this kind of blending of the senses, and you may commonly see sounds, but that's probably one of the least astonishing things about the DMT experience. Often people describe these geometric patterns as having more than the usual 3 spatial dimensions. They seem to kind of fold in on themselves in seemingly impossible ways, while still maintaining their geometrical integrity, in a way in which leads the majority of people to, when asked to rate how many dimensions the geometric patterns had, tend to say they had more than 3 spatial dimensions, which, like, although that is a possibility according to current theories in physics, like M theory, like where we've got 11 dimensions of space-time, it isn't thought that you can actually perceive more than 3 spatial dimensions. And I've had some good discussions with cosmologists and astrophysicists about, you know, the possibility of actually perceiving more than 3 spatial dimensions, and they say, well, no, it's not really possible, because, you know, they're kind of mathematical constructs, and they're kind of like dimensions are folded around themselves at the Planck length. You can't actually see them. Although that particular professor did changed their position a little bit after having retired and gone to an ayahuasca retreat. He now thinks it's a worthwhile idea to explore, but that's a whole other story. Again, this is probably one of the least astonishing features of the DMT experience, but certainly some of the most commonest. And what we find probably is the most astonishing part of the DMT experience is the encounter with entities. Um, you know, often sometimes of an insectoid nature, like giant praying mantises. These seem to pop up with alarming frequency. They're not actually that common, but I have encountered dozens, probably more, people who have a very specific entity encounter type, often nearly always naively to other people's experiences of a similar nature. Although now this meme, this dimethyltryptamine is now kind of loose on the internet, so it's probably grown its own insectoid legs at this point. But and that the experience is that people have the experience of having a giant praying mantis, often, you know, 10, 20 feet tall, looming over them, and kind of doing some kind of neurosurgery or neurological rearrangement on them, on their brain. They're kind of being operated on in their head, usually. Now, the praying mantis insectoid entities themselves are often described as usually neutral. Often they have no emotions, rarely benign, but never either considered evil either, but definitely kind of worrisome and troubling, just their very presence and their behavior. And sometimes people describe that they are being farmed for their emotions. Now, this is, okay, I can't say how many people have had this experience, probably less than 1% of all DMT users, but the fact that numerous people have had this experience is in and of itself quite curious. By far and away, probably the most common, or one of the most common DMT encounter experiences are with little people, what we might call elves or pixies or gnomes, dwarves, imps, whatever, you know, classic folkloric little people. Although not your standard kind of cuddly little pixies in kids' fairy books. Terence McKenna, you already mentioned. Peter, the kind of the great psychedelic raconteur and bard, describe these things as self-transforming machine elves because they don't really keep still. They're constantly shifting and morphing, and but they have the presence or appearance of an elf, of a little person. And of course, Terence said that with DMT, you get elves. Everybody does. Now, that was a little bit of an overstatement. Not everybody does get elves. I've had elves. I had elves on my first DMT experience. They were looming over me, kind of getting light and shoving it into my solar plexus, even though I didn't really have a body, because your body tends to disappear in DMT experiences. But the sense of where my solar plexus was or might be was being shoved full of light, and I was kind of, and it put me in this kind of blissful ecstatic state, and that was being conducted by what I could only describe as elves, although this was at a point in time before I'd come across any of the DMT folklore, if you like. So that was an interesting experience for me, and our survey research and that of others, as best we can, puts the prevalence of elves at somewhere between about 10 and 25% of people. So not quite everybody gets elves, but a lot of people get elves. So they're not entirely ubiquitous, but, you know, they do pop up a lot. And just as a little side story, I would say you don't necessarily even have to take DMT to get elves. Occasionally they do pop up in other psychedelic experiences and non-psychedelic experiences as well. You know, the kind of fairy folklore of not just the British Isles, but worldwide, is suffused with encounters with little people. So presumably people have been having spontaneous encounter experiences with little people for a very long time, although we can't be sure they're the same ones that turn up in DMT experiences. Nevertheless, and I'll tell you a little side story here. I was in Brazil organizing an academic conference on parapsychology, and we were invited to go during the conference every evening to various local groups who would take us on a journey into altered states of some kind, which was, quite intense because we had a whole day of academic papers for about 5 days running, and then every evening we'd go off somewhere. And the first one was drinking ayahuasca with a local indigenous community. The second night was drinking ayahuasca again with a Christian church, the Santa Daime. The third night, I think, was a Umbanda transpossession cult meeting. That was also very interesting. We're getting quite exhausted. By the fourth day, we went to see these people, the Gorani, who live in the jungles near where the conference was, and they invited us for a tobacco ceremony, which was like a great relief because we were getting quite deranged and exhausted by this point. However, something really peculiar happened in that everything went very, very strange that night, and we couldn't quite work out what had gone on, but we all had a kind of crazy adventure, misadventure, and in the morning we're all back at the conference for the final day, trying to piece together what happened the previous night, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, and all manner of extraordinary things are occurring. Like one of my ex-students, I should say, at that time had been dropped off at their hotel and found that their room was full of corpses, and was a little bit disturbed by that, and so went down to see the concierge to complain. And they said, look, I don't want to cause a fuss or anything, but I'm really tired and I want to go to sleep, and there's all these dead bodies in my room. Can you do something about it? And so they went up to the room, and of course all the bodies are gone, and they went to sleep. And we had like a multitude of these kind of stories. And then two of my ex-students had begged me to take them to this conference, and I thought it was probably a bad idea in case, it's not going to look good if they go mad. Turns out I lost the plot and they looked after me, so I'm really glad they did come along. But nevertheless, they said to me in the morning, like, did you see the little man dancing around the fire in the Indian's hut? And I was like, no, little man. It's like, you both saw him. They're like, yes. And was there, well, he must have been there then. And I was like, no, I don't remember seeing him. Could you describe him? And it was like, well, he was, about 3 or 4 foot high, and had like a kind of really, really wizened old face and big almond-shaped eyes, and he was kind of dancing around the. And one of them said, look, I actually made a sketch of what we saw. And she showed me this picture, which is, pretty good. There's the two of them dancing around the fire, and there's the weird little man with his big eyes and his wizened old face. And the moment I saw that, I said, well, wow, okay, no, I didn't see him, but I did see a woman look just like him on the minibus going back from the Indian's hut. And she's like, there's literally a little wizened old lady, a couple of seats in front of me, was kind of peering over the back of the chair and kind of grinning at me with a grin from kind of ear to ear, like looked about 300 years old, big black almond-shaped eyes, and was winking at me conspiratorially, kind of. And I'm like, who the hell is that? Is she one of the delegates from the conference? I was like, I had no idea who she was, but she seemed completely real. And of course, then, later that day, having to give another conference presentation, I realized what had happened, in that I couldn't actually read my notes, even though they were right in front of me, but I could read in great detail the poster hanging up at the other end of the lecture theatre, in that I had, like, my pupils were extremely dilated, and I recognized the symptoms as this being datura. I also had a very, very dry throat, and tried to have my epiglottis surgically removed during the night. That's a whole other story. Anyway, basically the Indians had spiked about 25 conference delegates with datura at a tobacco ceremony, and hadn't actually told anyone about it. The interesting thing is, though, like on some occasions, encounters with elves, as in this occasion, I would call that creature an elf, can be shared naively, and that really begs a whole other kind of set of questions about the ontological status of these things, of whether or not they are real. So I thought I'd throw that one in there for good measure, but that was not DMT. going back to DMT, it was first, well, not first, it had first been discovered in about the 1920s, I think, as a chemical, but its psychoactive properties weren't discovered until the 1950s by a Hungarian chemist and psychiatrist by the name of Stephen Sara, who had been trying to get hold of some LSD to do some research with, but couldn't get any, and so decided, based on some obscure accounts, that DMT might actually be psychoactive. He synthesized the chemical and injected it into himself and had the first recorded pure DMT experience. He then went on and injected it into his psychiatric colleagues as well, who would volunteer to test it. And one of them had this extraordinary account. So we have the very first DMT experiences and the first DMT encounter experiences. And one of his colleagues, a psychiatrist, said, "The whistling has stopped. I have arrived, and in front of me are two quiet, sunlit gods. They gaze at me and nod in a friendly manner. I think they are welcoming me into this new world." So we have the extant accounts of DMT entity encounters from the get-go, the first kind of use of this pure chemical in the 1950s. And interestingly, in some of those accounts, people talk, unfortunately, all the original trip reports or experiences have been lost to history because the hospital where he worked had a fire, as did all his archives. But there is a few kind of comments published in one of his early papers about people's experiences. And in one of them, one of his patients, in fact, had an encounter with what she called dwarves, blue dwarves. So, encounters with little people are there before Terence McKenna let loose with his dimethyltryptamines and infected the minds of all potential DMT users with the idea that you're actually going to get elves. The elves were probably always there. So, nobody really knew much about DMT. It wasn't very popular in the 1960s and all the rest of it until this research by the name of Rick Strassman came along in the 1990s and actually kind of was the man to get psychedelic research back on the agenda again after, the hiatus since the end of the 1960s. And he started working with DMT for some scientific reasons, but partly because nobody knew what it was really, and he was likely to get it past the regulators and the ethics bodies. And he injected 60 volunteers with varying doses, including high doses of DMT, and was astonished to discover that the majority of them, more than half of them, he said, had encounters with entities. And he said, given that DMT is contained already within our bodies, in our brains, and that people have these encounters with extraordinary beings, like perhaps endogenous DMT, DMT in our bodies, could account for spontaneous occurrences of encounters with entities, such as during sleep paralysis, alien abduction experiences, so on and so forth, spiritual, mystical experiences, near-death experiences, and so on. And he's probably trying to explain too much with DMT, but it is curious that it is in our bodies naturally. And in the last few years, there wasn't much done on DMT since the time of Strassman in the 90s. But in the last 4 or 5, 6 years now, myself and colleagues at Imperial and elsewhere in the world have been reviving the research interest in DMT. My good colleague Chris Timmerman at Imperial was the first to report on his experiments. He had a pilot group and injected them with DMT in the lab, and 75% of them had encounters with entities. In my own research, which I may or may not talk more about, we did a kind of naturalistic study going around to people's houses, and they would smoke their own DMT, and we had like 95% of them had encounter experiences with DMT. So DMT is very, very reliable at high doses, inducing encounter experiences. We also found that over 70% of them believe those encounters to be real. Okay. That there's the other thing about DMT is that it has this sense of hyperreality, what we call hyperreality, that the DMT realm often feels more real than this world. Okay, so when people have these encounters, they believe them to be real as well. And the majority of our participants believe the entities to have their own extant sentience and ontological existence. So going back to this adage that, and I'll finish soon, DMT experience is a bit like being punched in the back of the head by God, which is a great way of summarizing the intensity of the experience. We do have some nice data to back that up now. The Johns Hopkins Medical University in the States, one of the leading medical university institutions in the States, did a survey of over several thousand people. I can't remember how exactly they had, of people who had DMT breakthrough doses and had an encounter with an entity, and they asked them about their prior spiritual and metaphysical beliefs, and they found that of those people who had encountered an entity on DMT and professed to be atheist beforehand, right, less than half of them remained atheist afterwards. So here we have a super quick acting, intense, naturally occurring in the body psychedelic, which in the space of 10 minutes can convert more than half of all atheists into non-atheists, just to give you a sense of how intense that experience can be. And there are various positions which have been kind of proffered to explain that. And this kind of ties in beautifully with, and I think I actually liked your phrasing more in the entity pill video you did earlier there, Peter. And I think you called the positions as skeptical, the psychological, the ontological, or the second one was, I can't recall, but they map quite closely to these more academic positions, but exactly the same. And so the various explanations put forward are the more skeptical one, or, you know, materialist one, is that what we call a constructivist or neurotheological reductionist perspective. Let's just call it skeptical, that, you know, the entities are really just a production of our own perturbed neurobiology from having ingested some really potent psychedelic agent, which has disrupted all of our normal neural firing. So they're just a kind of aberrant kind of output from dabbling around with our brains like a neurochemistry playset, right? And there's nothing more to their reality. Alongside this, and this is an interesting position, is that what we call the contextualist position or argument, and that is because, like, our entire life experience kind of primes us for everything later that we are going to experience. You can never have a culture-free or a culturally unmediated experience. All of our current experiences will be colored by our prior life experiences and all the culture and media that we've consumed throughout our life. So Terence McKenna coming along in whenever it was in the 1980s and going, you get elves, everybody does, means that even if you don't think you've ever come across that particular piece of media, which of course most people have now, the fact that it's out there, we can't know for certain that you didn't see, you saw elves because you like listened to Terence McKenna, right? Or you're aware of the idea that you get elves when you take DMT. Giant praying mantis beings is probably a little bit more troublesome because they haven't particularly had their own memosphere. But you know, but nevertheless, some of these encounters do pop up with alarming frequency, but we can't say that it wasn't due to some prior encounter with the folklore that exists out there. However, we can go back to the very first trip reports from the 1950s and go, people were encountering little people even then. And there hasn't really been any good experiments that were done prior to the internet and this kind of overwhelming glut of information and therefore memes, etc., that were conducted. You know, there was reports of supposedly an experiment in Berkeley where they gave ayahuasca to Eskimos and they saw serpents and snakes, right? Supposedly, as you would if you took ayahuasca in the jungle or if you know about ayahuasca. And of course, you don't get, sorry, did I say serpents or snakes? Serpents, snakes, or jaguars in the Arctic. However, it turns out that was just a urban myth that kind of was traced back to the kind of 60s in Berkeley. Didn't actually happen. The closest thing we have to an experiment resembling this was from Claudio Naranjo, this Chilean psychotherapist who did an experiment in the 70s where he gave urban Chileans who lived in Santiago, not in the jungle. He gave them ayahuasca vine, and many of them had experiences of flying over the jungle and seeing serpents and so on. However, that bit of research was not reported or published in a kind of peer-reviewed journal. It was just kind of reported kind of in a kind of ad hoc way in a book. So it's a bit hard to get beyond the contextualist argument in a way. Finally, the other arguments are, the essentialist perennialist idea, that these may be kind of some kind of universal higher reality like archetypes. Brilliantly, we may be interacting with some facet of our own psyche in some kind of way. That's kind of like a psychological explanation. And archetypes is something that people invoke often in kind of explaining these beings, which goes some way. However, Jung was gloriously vague in defining exactly what archetypes were in terms of their ontological status. But nevertheless, it helps us to think about these things perhaps symbolically as a facet of our own psyche. Although, of course, Jung acknowledged that our psyche in the collective unconscious could extend beyond our own individual self. So who knows? Archetypes feels like a nice, safe place to put them sometimes. And of course, then the final position is what Peter called the ontological position, and that is these things are as they appear at face value. They are some kind of real self-existent sentient entity. Yeah, that's the position favored actually by a majority of people who have DMT experiences. It's very hard to actually prove or disprove that particular position. But yeah, maybe we can explore that. I'm probably going to pause it there. What I'll just kind of quickly add on is that in the quest of trying to understand these experiences over the last couple of decades, we put on a couple of symposia, myself and Anton Bilton and Rory Spowers, and we invited what we thought to be the kind of greatest minds on the planet who had anything to say about this subject. And we produced a couple of books. Sorry you didn't get an invite, Peter. I wasn't aware of your interests when we put on these symposia. And so, we came up probably with more questions than we did answers, but we have attempted to kind of fathom the depths of the existence or not of these beings and what they may not be. People have put forward various ideas that they're perhaps our future selves speaking back through time to us. Perhaps they are interoceptive beings, perhaps we're just talking to our own mitochondria. Perhaps they are really kind of elves and aliens and deities out there, or perhaps they're just a figment of our drug-addled brains, or archetypes. So I try and be agnostic. I'm not very good at it. Yeah, let's open it up for some discussion. I'm going to close these slides as well.
Yeah, thanks for that presentation, David. It was awesome. I really enjoyed it, especially like the kind of the more academic framing of the ontological theories of these things. So if anyone has any questions, pop in the chat, and I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself, ask your question, David. I have one or two warm-up questions. So out of the 4 ontological theories that you listed of the entities, where do you currently land?
Yeah, well, like I say, I try to be agnostic, but I'm not very good at it. And my opinions vary, depending on the day and how recently I've engaged in a kind of psychedelic journey, probably. So like I don't have a fixed position. I think that's fair to say. And I think it's like different hats for different days. Uh, I think, I think it's worthwhile, exploring the neurobiological reductionist explanations, which are kind of great. I've had debates with Robin over this, some publicly. And like, I don't think our current neurobiological understanding really fits the data fully. Like, why would people seemingly naively and independently have encounters with beings which have very specific behaviors and appearances? Robin Carhart-Harris, this leading psychedelic researcher and neuroscientist, poses that, well, we're getting kind of thrown up a lot of random data in our kind of sensorium, in our kind of visual field and mental imagery, and like through the kind of what he calls, like well, it's like a kind of type of pareidolia or apophenia. We tend to see what we're primed to see, and if you're showing random information or data, we're primed to see faces, right? Like we see faces in the plugs and in the clouds and in door handles, and we're primed to see faces. And he's saying, well, in this kind of random data in our visual field, we're primed to see faces, and then we apply kind of sentience to it, right? Because we're in this kind of extreme altered state. And that's kind of good as far as it goes. But it falls down on a few points. One is that, like, I've done some research with people who have what's called aphantasia. They have no visual mental imagery whatsoever. I have this one guy had taken DMT 1,000 times, bless him. Like, I don't know how he managed that. Probably because he does have aphantasia, has no mental imagery. And so he never sees anything. Okay. And now aphantasia is this condition. He only got given a name 10 years ago, right? Now I've done some research on it, and they've established that it seems to be genuine. Like, they do behavioral tasks on people, and they literally do not respond to stimuli in the same way people who can have mental imagery do, right? So that we know it's genuine, that they really have no visual mental imagery whatsoever. It's not like they can't access it, they just don't have it. And yet this guy still got entity encounters, as did another person with aphantasia who took DMT we did research with. So like, he was able to describe their characteristics, their, the nature of their being and appearance without ever seeing them. It's just like he had a sense of an encounter with an experience, with an entity, without actually seeing anything. So that calls into question the fact that we're just driven by visual noise, right? And in kind of picking out these things from, like, in an apophenic way. And the other thing is that if it was just kind of random firing of the brain and just picking, falsely detecting a signal in the noise, then why is it so many people get encounters with giant praying mantises doing kind of surgical operations on them and farming them for their emotions, right? That is so specific as to defy a kind of respectable kind of reductionist explanation. The mimetic stuff is harder to get past. The idea that our experiences are always primed by our life experiences. But, and I've looked into this as well, but the idea of encounters with giant praying mantises isn't particularly out there. There was one account from Timothy Leary in the 70s in a really obscure journal. It started popping up in the alien abduction community in the like 1990s. But it's not something that anybody particularly written about with DMT until, relatively recently. And yet I've met people who didn't know anything about DMT, and on their first DMT or ayahuasca experience, they had these encounters with giant praying mantises. But we can't rule out that argument either. Nevertheless, the data, begs perhaps a different interpretation. And so I try and keep an open mind, and I'm open to the literalist explanations, the ontological explanations. I've had my own experiences which felt completely real at the time. And, you know, I think there's also a danger of a kind of intellectual hubris from the kind of the global north or the west or the Euro-American intellectual position of you know, like nullifying these things as pure superstition and backwards superstitious religious thinking. But you know, indigenous people the world over who have worked with psychedelics for thousands of years in many cases, you know, believe these things to be real. And here we are, these kind of fantastically advanced Westerners. We've only known about psychedelics really for about 100 years, and there is a danger of a kind of intellectual hubris to just dismiss these encounters as mere neurobiology out of hand. So, but I think it deserves more exploration, and I'm not willing to put money on any one position. I'm sorry to be so slippery.
That's cool. I think having the capacity for ontological diversity is probably helps with navigating this phenomenon. The other question I had, Bob actually asked it in the chat. Bob Faulkner, who was here last week talking about unattached burdens. Bob, could you ask your question?
Hi, David. Yeah. Do you ever encounter people after, especially ayahuasca experiences, feel and believe that they have an entity within them that's really messing with them, causing them pretty serious problems? And how do you work with that?
Yeah, not often, I have to say, but it does happen. Yeah, absolutely. So been working on this challenging psychedelic experience project, and we surveyed people, only those people who'd had long-term psychological challenges from their psychedelic experiences, right? Which maybe account for a small percentage of all psychedelic users. And then we looked at the kind of things that people were reporting. You know, about half of them had some kind of ontological shock. I'm glad to say only about 2% said that they'd had some kind of possession experience. So it does happen. It doesn't happen often. I've witnessed it a few times as well. So a small percent, a very small percentage, like overall, you know, probably like less than 0.5%, probably even less than that, you know, maybe like 0.1%, 1 in 1,000 maybe, have possession-like experiences that they find long-term troubling, disturbing, difficult to deal with. But nevertheless, those experiences do occur, and we don't really have a good approach to dealing with that. I mean, this is probably one of the first times it's even been reported in the psychedelic research literature, and that only came out, actually hasn't even been published yet. So you know, this is like, it's not something that people talk about in the psychedelic community, particularly, certainly not on an academic level. And yet, you know, there could be numerous ways to deal with that. For some people, like, and it's different for different people. I think some people may benefit from like moving away from that position ontologically altogether and just trying to ground themselves. Or it could be that they consult a shaman, or they go to a psychotherapist, or you know, God help them, a psychiatrist. You know, and so people will seek different treatments. And for some, like, they want a more kind of grounded, you know, traditional Western approach, and for others, they want to have somebody to do effectively an exorcism on them, right? So really, but we're not in the position to kind of recommend any particular kind of treatment avenue for anybody around those issues, because like this kind of is kind of relatively new altogether.
Yeah. Any follow-up question, Bob?
Well, that's the work I do, is helping people get things like that out of them. So I probably see a unfair percentage of the cases.
Yeah, I'd be interested in that. Do you get a lot of people coming yourself from having had you know, plant medicine ceremonies and
Yeah,
just,
ayahuasca more than anything else by far. And could you comment also on entities in 5-MeO DMT as opposed to NN-DMT?
yeah, very good. So that's certainly not as common. For those of you who don't know, like DMT is what NN-DMT usually called just DMT, and that's what's found in ayahuasca. But there's another kind as well called 5-MeO DMT, which is found in some plants like a penna, a yopo, but also most commonly people know it from toad venom, snoring desert toad. And again, it's vaporized. It's a really short, super intense experience, lasts 10 minutes, very similar in kind of intensity and time as a DMT experience, although like different to DMT experiences. DMT experiences are usually like absolutely jam-packed, full of content, right? It's like experiencing the whole universe at high speed condensed into 10 minutes, whereas 5-MeO DMT experiences are more commonly like the absence of content. Like people get like white light, non-duality, bliss, peace, like no mind kind of experiences generally, but not always. And occasionally people do have encounters and things like that, but they're far less common with 5-MeO DMT than they are with DMT.
Mhm.
I'd be interested if you'd get people coming with toad venom attachments.
A few, but not, you're right, way less. One
Oh
more
yeah.
question, if I can squeeze it in. Rick Strassman said that after all his work with DMT, it changed his whole model of spirituality from like a Zen meditation kind of thing to a relational, interactive spirituality with other intelligent beings. Is that happening to you?
I mean, I think I've always been a bit like that, to be honest with you, personally. Yeah, and it is really interesting. And that's the kind of juxtaposition we see, like between DMT and 5-MeO DMT. It's like all of the ideas around like the psychedelic mystical experience are, you know, the measures we use even is like about unity experiences, you know, feeling at one with the universe, transcending time and space, feeling at one with yourself. And that's the kind of classic mystical experiences measured. But like DMT experiences are not like that. It's like there is a self and another. It's relational. You get that with 5-MeO, but with DMT, it's like there's nearly always entities. It's nearly always relational. It is rarely unitive, right? There's a self and there's another. It's an I and a thou kind of experience, which is a very different kind. It's still mystical, I guess, but it's not a kind of classic unitive mystical experience. And so it kind of begs a different kind of cosmology and ontology in a way, which fits very much with a kind of shamanic perspective. You know, shamanism is relational. It's not transcendent. It's not about becoming one with the Godhead or whatever. It's very pragmatic. You know, they deal with these what we call entities or spirits, they call whatever they call them, but it's relational, and they are like aspects of themselves. They exist within a community of these beings as much as they exist within a community of human beings in the material world, and they interact with them in the same kind of way, in a relational way. And the job of the shaman is an intermediary between the living, like humans, and the invisible beings, and they are in betweeners. They're go-betweeners. They are mediators between the worlds and within the worlds. And so like psychedelic experiences on the whole kind of drive that kind of relational experience, but very much so. And I think we're seeing a lot of that occurring, and I think that's what's kind of underpinning people changing their relationship to nature as well, which is a good thing. You know, people taking psychedelics and suddenly they are way more connected to the natural world, and they're taking more care of the world. They're changing their diet and their shopping habits and increasing the amount of gardening they do and shifting their careers to something that is more akin to living harmoniously and as part of nature. So yeah, I think so. It's relational on different levels. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Ultimately, whatever our ontological position is, right? There's a flip side as well, though, of course, and is that people get terrified of possession, demonic forces, sorcery, hexes, attachments, etc., etc. That's the kind of the flip side of that kind of ontology. And just to add, Amazonian ayahuasca use prior to Westerners turning up was all about sorcery. A lot of it, like research in the 70s by anthropologists, when they consulted ayahuasqueros about, what their kind of job is, like the majority of their work, people would consult them for love magic, how to make somebody fall in love with them. A lot of it was to do with either mostly removing the effects of sorcery or doing sorcery, like, sending magic darts to people. And a little bit of it, the minority, was to do with healing. Okay. So, and that's now kind of changed shape due to market forces of Westerners going there, wanting spiritual enlightenment, reduce their depression, develop the KPIs on their new tech app, whatever it is. People aren't necessarily going out there for sorcery and love magic. So the market forces have changed what ayahuasca heroes do, but that whole world of sorcery and entities and all the rest of it is very much part of the ayahuasca cosmology. So no doubt that people turn up at your doorstep wanting entities removed.
Thank you, Bob. We have a lot of great questions. Sarah, I'll take you in next.
Hi. Just a quick question about whether you see human souls. You've talked a lot about, other entities, praying mantis beings and little people, but no stories about whether people see loved ones who have passed or friends who have passed, either on DMT or 5-MeO DMT. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, less so 5-MeO. Interestingly in our survey work and our interviews with DMT, we were trying to find correspondences with near-death experiences, actually, because there's a lot of research suggesting that actually a near-death experience is could be potentially be due to like a release of DMT at the brain when you have like a life-threatening incident. Great to see the ballerinas in the background there. And we looked at the kind of experiences people, and on paper they look very similar, but one thing you get in near-death experiences very commonly is encounters with deceased loved ones, right? Usually, sometimes kind of angelic beings or something like that, and these don't tend to pop up quite as much with DMT, although they probably pop up more with ayahuasca. Like, so some of the classic early kind of explorers and their experiences and encounters with ayahuasca led to it being the first chemical when it was isolated from ayahuasca was actually from the ayahuasca vine. It was called harmine, not DMT. It's a different chemical, but it was called telepathine, right, in the 1920s when it was first isolated on account of the stories from ethnobotanists and explorers before the 1920s who had encountered ayahuasca. And there's a handful of stories, and they all relate to encounters with people who just died. Nearly always, there was this one guy. He saw a vision of his dead father, and that his sister was very sick. And this was in the kind of late 19th century. And then it took him 18 days to get out of the jungle, maybe the turn of the century, and he received a telegram 18 days later saying that his father had died whilst he was in the jungle. So that's one of the classic stories. There are other accounts of another explorer having an ayahuasca ceremony, and then the chief said, "Oh no, the chief from the next village has just died," in his ayahuasca experience, right? It's like, oh, he's died. So like those kind of encounters with deceased humans, yeah, do seem to pop up anecdotally, at least in ayahuasca experiences, less so than with DMT. We found about 1% of people in our DMT work had an encounter with a deceased human. So it does pop up, but not that much. You're more likely to get elves, probably more likely to get praying mantises or a giant octopus.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. John, you had a good question. You can mute yourself.
My question was, have there been people, shamans, psychonauts, etc., who have developed levels of competence in traversing these other worlds and possibly interacting and skillfully responding to these entities? I'm curious if there's been accounts of the kind of capacities and skills experience traversers can develop. So when I'm imagining like a praying mantis possibly doing a surgery on me or someone, have there been people who can kind of like sidestep or say, no, thank you, not now, or maybe like come at me, do whatever you want?
I mean, yes. I mean, that is the whole work and process of indigenous shamanic peoples. You know, they work with these invisible beings, which you can perceive in these altered states. They develop relationships with them, not just within their own work, but, you know, they can be hereditary relationships from their community across hundreds and maybe even thousands of years. I work with this indigenous tribe from Mexico called the Baradica. They've probably been using peyote in that region, according to archaeological evidence, for over 5,500 years. They have a very ancient lineage, and they've been working with the same beings ceremonially for hundreds of years, thousands of years. And so they have a very kind of like maintained ritual structure, which, you know, requires that you do certain practices and make certain offerings, and that you keep out the entities you don't want, and you invite in the ones that you want to work with and negotiate with. It's, you know, it's a kind of like metaphysical hygiene basics for kind of shamanic work. Something that in the West we're not really equipped to do or deal with, particularly outside of some religious structures. But, you know, as in our kind of increasingly secular, science kind of driven kind of worldview, there is no room for that kind of process and practice. But yeah, for sure, indigenous people and other religious practices around the world will ensure that they are communicating with and operating with the entities they want in the way they want. And you know, shamanism by itself is effectively it's a matter of coercion and negotiation with invisible beings, right? Kind of later derivations of, you know, there's a theory within anthropology by Michael Winkelmann that, like, you know, your traditional nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes practice a kind of raw form of shamanism, and that is, as people became increasingly sedentary and politically integrated and agricultural, they started adopting more kind of mediumistic practices and even possession and what we call incorporation kind of practices. But traditionally, you know, shamans never really get possessed. They're there to kind of keep the spirits there right in front of them and negotiate with them, sometimes coerce them or control them into doing what they ask, as opposed to actually being kind of controlled or entered by the spirit. That seems to be a later kind of development as we became more sedentary and politically integrated and, you know, civilized and all the rest of it. So yeah, absolutely. Answer to your question.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Would you recommend any of these researchers or thinkers to look deeper into with regards to that question?
Well, that's the work of Michael Winkelmann, who's an anthropologist of shamanism. I mean, there's a lot out there. Maybe have a look at our book on, we edited an anthology called Talking with the Spirits, which is all about cross-cultural essays on mediumship and possession, and also like how it differs and overlaps with shamanism. It's called Talking with the Spirits.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, John. A good follow-up question would be Carl Smith.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, Dave. Great to see you here. Yeah, my question. I know you've done a bit of research into dream recording, trip recording, and it came up last session with Bob as well around this idea of, obviously, you know, it's only the brave like Peter that and ourselves that are talking about possession, and you know the potential impact that has on you know, getting mental health diagnoses of not very pleasant you know, diagnoses, as you know, you're sort of seen in a negative sense. So do you think if trip recording becomes a thing, and I'd love to know what the latest science is on trip recording, will it open up the floodgates to accepting this ontological diversity that we all believe is there? And do you think, you know, some of the things that some people that are diagnosed with schizophrenia maybe not having schizophrenia but actually having possession, if we can visually record it?
Oh, I see what you mean. Like, oh, I see the kind of like hyper scanning, replaying back what's going on in a person's visual cortex in a kind of AI generated yeah, kind of video format. That's super interesting. I hadn't thought about the implications of that. That could be very, very interesting. I think it could well shift like our perspectives and questions. I think the real problem is like, you know, the way science is done is like, it doesn't like going into these territories, right? And so it only asks the kinds of questions that allow it to get the kind of materialist answers they can handle, right? So, you know, nobody's out there going, oh, let's devise some research to see if entities are real. Nobody's really interested in that. It's scientists. They value their careers and their reputations too much. So even though we may have this technology and it will possibly lead to those kind of like more open-minded perspectives, you know, scientists aren't queuing up to ask career-defying questions about the nature of these beings. That's part of the problem. It's not like people have been having these experiences for ages already. You know, it's just that it's seen as career suicide, and it's only in this last decade or two, with the psychedelic renaissance, that we're even allowed to talk about these experiences at all. Before that, you know, they're just consigned to the wastebasket of hallucination. You know, anything that isn't in your normal waking state of consciousness is either a hallucination or a delusion, and we don't have to explain it or unpack it. It's just, that's what it is. Forget about it. You know, you should be thankful you're not hallucinating now, kind of thing, right? So like, I think we are entering a new era where we're beginning to explore this territory in a bit more open-minded way, because the cork is out of the genie's bottle with the current kind of renaissance of interest in psychedelics. But you know, we haven't yet published the data points that 2% of people having long-term negative consequences had possession experiences, right? So it's still early days, but I think in time, yeah, the kind of technology that's coming through and the more kind of open-minded approach of some scientists could have us exploring these different experiences in a more kind of ontologically neutral way. Not even just ontologically neutral, you have to be asking the right kinds of questions as well, I think. And most scientists are too afraid to actually do that. I committed career suicide ages ago, so it doesn't really matter for me. But good question. Thanks, Carl.
Any follow-up question, Carl?
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, you mentioned technology. I mean, Peter's named this series Entity Pill. but I'm thinking entity tech. You know, like what technologies, now that we've got things like the Halo band due to come out any moment soon, which is lucid dreaming on demand, effectively. And I know you've done a lot of work, and there's a whole protocol that enables lucid dreaming. It's a lot of work, but if we have a technology that shortcuts it, means, you know, like most technology, you don't need to do the work, you just have lucid dreams, and everyone's having lucid dreams. Then it will be like, who's having the most bizarre, coolest lucid dreams? That will become the new currency. So I think that this is the moment where this opens up to, like you say, we weren't allowed to talk about this stuff. Then it'll be the only thing we talk about. That's probably where the technology will take us. But I guess my follow-up is like, could you just talk a little bit about how dreams and trips could be recorded? Is it the visual cortex that's recorded and then analyzed with AI? I know I've seen, you know, images that you look at, and then the AI, the machine learning, is then reconstructing those images. But just tell us a little bit, if you know much more than I, about how the technology works.
Yeah, exactly that. It's a kind of like, usually the way it's done is like you train, you kind of get a very highly sensitive EEG, for instance. You can do it with fMRI, but you can also do it with EEG, particularly looking at the occipital lobe, which is the visual cortex, which, you know, processes visual phenomena. And usually, well, so far it's been done that you train people, well, you train the technology. So it's recording this high definition data of your neural activity in the cortex, and then you get it to record the output from your cortex whilst you're watching a set of random YouTube clips. So you're training it on kind of extant data, right? In much the same way as, you know, large language processors are kind of trained on internet data. So as you were training it on your specific individual neural activity in the back of your head, and then it gets to a point where it can recreate to a fairly accurate degree what it is you're actually seeing, and it's not kind of 100%, but you'll get the kind of sense of they're looking at a building with a door and there's a person on the roof and there's a sky, right? And it will kind of recreate that, but it'll be a bit like AI-esque, right? So it's fairly accurate to an extent. At least you can see what's going on. And then the idea is, and there's been this one study where they did it with dreaming. But this is kind of based on the premise that the experience of what we are seeing is mediated through the visual cortex, which may or may not be the case with DMT and DMT entities, especially given that people who have no visual mental imagery still have DMT entity encounters, right? So it's yet to be demonstrated. No one's done it with the psychedelic experiences yet, but the principle is that, yeah, you train the algorithms on your particular neural activity for a particular set of visual data, and then it can recreate whatever's going on in your occipital lobe. So yeah, I'd love to see what comes out of your head, Carl.
Don't we all?
Maybe not. It's too much.
Thank you, Carl. Okay, let's go with Jonathan next. Jonathan, you had a skeptical question.
Well, I had two questions, but I can. Yeah, I think for me the most important question is about these insectoid alien brain surgery creatures. If we go with the contextualist or mimetic idea of them, maybe you shouldn't talk about them, basically, because then you kind of plant the seed in people. And I'm curious on your take on that whole thing.
Yeah,
Especially
absolutely.
yeah.
I mean, I usually preface my talks by saying, you know, I've now ruined it. I mean, there is one other encounter which I've had, which I found, which kind of really blew my mind, put me off taking DMT. In fact, it scared the life out of me. And I then found kind of trip reports scattered around in various publications and online of other people having the same encounter experience. And so then I wrote about that. But then, of course, you know, I've also then ruined the possibility of ever collecting more data on that in a way in which it hasn't been confounded by possible memes, you know. But and that's the choice you have to take, isn't it? It's like, well, do I talk about this stuff in an educational way, or do I just wear my total scientist hat and say, right, well, I'm not going to talk about that because I'll ruin any possibility of later data collection. But you know, there are other beings out there, you know, that people have encounters with, which we could easily point to. There's a book coming out pretty soon, actually, a kind of a bestiary of DMT entities, with kind of diagrams and stuff. So, you know, all of this research is going to be pretty much blown anytime soon. And what best we can do is look historically, or trying to devise other routes of experimentation to explore that. And for one of the things we're doing is looking at shared experiences. So like people having DMT at the same time, but you know, in kind of sensorially separated, so they can't actually talk to each other about their experience as it's happening. In fact, we don't need to, because they don't ever say anything when they're on DMT. But and then see at the degree of similarity of their experiences, having had the intention of sharing their experience, because it's something that people report. You know, they have ayahuasca ceremonies, and people report saying that, yeah, they had this really profound connection with the other person in the room, and we were kind of there together. And then they talk afterwards and they go, yeah, I had the same experience. So it's something that people report. We can try and triangulate the kind of the ontological reality of these experiences in other ways as well. But yeah, trying to prevent a meme from escaping is, you know, if I don't talk about it, somebody else might anyway, right? So it's kind of like whack-a-mole. But thanks for that.
Yeah, I had another question, if I have the time. So it's about DMT breakthroughs, where it's like you're transported into some other realm, which I think is connected to a lot of these experiences of these entities. And I'm curious about like the ontology of that. Is it like, if you treat it as literally real, is it some kind of soul transfer, like consciousness transfer into some other realm? Or yeah, and I get that this is very out there, but I'm just curious what your reflections are about that.
I mean, I don't know if you're actually going anywhere in a physical sense. Like, I think what it kind of throws up is like, we have so many unknowns. Like, we do not know what consciousness is. There was a review paper just came out a few months ago. This guy's published this 165-page article, which got published in an academic journal, reviewing the major theories, just the major theories of consciousness. And there's literally like 100 different perspectives, you know, and that's like, he's missed out a whole bunch as well. And it's like, nobody knows what consciousness is or does. Everybody's got an idea about it. And we don't even understand the fundamentals of like, what is consciousness, let alone what happens when our consciousness goes rogue and roams off to other dimensions, or whatever it feels like is happening. And so, you know, we can speculate all we like, and traditions and belief systems all around the world have chosen to speculate, and that's their cosmologies, right? But I don't think we have a good handle on it. I don't think we necessarily can even have a good handle on it. And I think it's a matter of like making our own meaning out of this, whatever works for you individually, I think. And if it helps to think of it about going to another dimension, then great, you know. But yeah, we certainly have more unknowns than we have knowns. You know, the more we discover, the more we realize how little we know, and it's increasing complexity all the time, the more discoveries we make. So I don't hold out any hope that in my lifetime we're going to have any firm answers.
Yeah, thank you.
Question though.
So we'll maybe sneak one more question in, and we'll close in about 10 minutes. Holly, Kevin, you had a fun question on DMT entities.
Yes, very simple, David. Question for David. We've talked about the elves. What do the elves want? You've talked about, okay, so the praying mantises, maybe they want to feed on human emotions. But yeah, just in case of like the elves, what do they want? Each of these, is there like a common understanding of like, or common stories about like what their motives are? Are they benevolent, mischievous, malevolent, whatever? Would love to hear about that. Thank you.
Yeah, before we talk about the elves, though, just make sure I haven't given the mantids any bad rep, in that the majority of people feel like the brain operation they've done on them has given them some kind of upgrade, or they feel like, even though they tend to feel a bit like unnerved, mostly neutral, sometimes slightly kind of worried about the mantids, most people kind of come away with this, but they did some kind of upgrade and now I feel great. And actually, you know, I think they did something beneficial. So yeah, even though they seem quite neutral and maybe farming if your emotions, they might be actually doing benign things. The elves, on the other hand, are, you know, pretty prankish. Like, people turn up and like often it's the elves they encounter first, or only, and they're kind of often there welcoming you, like literally holding up little signs saying, "Welcome back, we missed you." And so they're like, and they're very tricksterish, you know, often like showing you kind of hyperdimensional toys or some kind of gadget or puzzle which you cannot actually make any sense of. It's almost like they're there kind of distracting you, or kind of like, here, look at this, you know. They're often trying to lead you down some kind of weird path, and like, but bamboozling. They are there to bamboozle, it seems, if they have an agenda. They're there to welcome you. They're there to play with you. They are the real trickster archetype. And in some cases, where people don't necessarily get elves, one of the other archetypal DMT encounters we get is like the jester, the ringmaster, the harlequin. Quite literally, people see these kind of like jokers that appear, which again is kind of like a more human manifestation of the trickster. You know, if the elves are part of the trickster archetype, that is very much the kind of the human embodiment of the trickster archetype. And that's one of the only correspondences with Jung's archetypes we find, is the trickster. The trickster definitely turns up in DMT entity encounters, as it does in Jungian mythology. So what is their role then? To just to turn things on its head, to kind of give you a sense of another reality, that you're not in Kansas anymore. And you know, I think tricksters are often, certainly in world mythology, is amoral. You know, I don't say they're good or they're bad particularly. Like Loki, you know, sometimes is good, sometimes is bad, but he's always playing tricks. And there does seem to be a kind of amorality to these little creatures. They're not often malevolent, but certainly in the folklore, you know, pre-DMT folklore, I'm talking about Celtic mythology, or Celtic, what Evans Wentz called, you know, the fairy faith of the Celtic nations. He did this kind of study in kind of 1910 or whatever it was. He collected all this kind of oral history of people's stories and encounters with little people without any DMT. And often they would be pretty nasty, these little people. They weren't to be trusted, but you also had to kind of engage with them and, like, you know, keep them on the right side. People would leave offerings to them so that they would be benign and not malevolent. In some stories they can bestow great gifts, and in other stories they can bestow curses. So, like, beyond just the DMT lore, LORE, like, you know, the lore of elves is one of the amoral trickster, I would say. So who knows what their actual agenda is, but that's the kind of function they play, I would say. I don't know if that answers your question.
Right,
No, that
cool.
was great. Thank you.
All right, cool. Thanks, Kevin. And yeah, we'll gently close here. Great questions today, everyone. Great answers, David. Any parting words you would like to leave us with before we close today's session?
Like I would say is like, regardless of what ultimately is the ontological status of these things, is like what matters most is what we believe about them, right? I think, and like better psychonaut scientists than myself have come up with great dictums around this, and I'm going to quote John C. Lilly on this, in that he had this kind of brilliant dictum which kind of sums up everything, in that it's our beliefs about these things which are the most important, regardless of what ultimately these things are. And he said, like, in the province of the mind, what we believe to be real either is real or becomes real within certain parameters. And those parameters are to be discovered experimentally and experientially. And yet when discovered, those parameters turn out to be more beliefs to be transcended. In the province of the mind, there are no limitations. So basically, you know, our reality is our belief, and our belief is our reality. So whatever we believe these things to be is our reality, regardless of whether they're actually real or not real. So I'm going to leave with that little paradox and make a quick escape. But thank you so much for having me.
Beautiful. Yeah, I'll make some closing announcements in a moment, but David, thank you so much for coming to the Anti-Pill series. It was a great addition. And yeah, check out his books, Other Worlds, and there's a bunch of others you can check on Amazon and his website. And then next week, we got Demonic Foes, Richard Gallagher joining us, which should be an interesting one. So yeah, you can check that up, or you can apply to the series if you haven't applied yet, if you're watching on YouTube, or you can just watch the rest of the series on the channel. That being said, David, everyone, thanks so much for coming to Stoa.